Anarchy, murder, violence, chaos. These are the things people picture when they hear the term moral nihilism. If people have no guide to show them what is right and wrong, society will simply devolve into this state of nature. But would this actually happen, or at least move in this direction? I'll argue that this is a misunderstanding of what moral nihilism means. There are two major things that this doesn't take into account: an alternative to morality and collective interest. But before I go into these arguments, I need to establish that metaphysically there is no such thing as objective morality. And to do that, we need to first identify what morality even is. Morality teaches us what is right and wrong. What does this mean? Well, since right and wrong are usually referred to when describing an action, or a state of being that is the result of actions, then morality in the modern interpretation means what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. In this sense, if someone asks why they ought to do something and you reply with, because it's moral, then you're essentially saying that you should do it because you should do it. On the other hand, if you explain that you should do it because of X, Y, and Z reasons, and that those reasons are what make it moral, then why bring morality into the conversation when you already gave your reasons? In this sense, morality is redundant with the reasons behind it, making morality a completely unnecessary component of rational discussion. In fact, it may hinder it due to increased emotions inhibiting rational thought. So when you break it down, morality is simply a shorthand for what we ought to do, the reasons for which have already been determined by the dogma behind it. And since morality is necessarily objective, this means that in its purest form, morality translates to the objective ought to. Before we go any further, I should get this misconception out of the way. Moral nihilism is not subjectivist. Moral subjectivism believes that morality exists. It's just that it's subjective to different groups or individuals. Though it does believe in objective morals in a weird way, in the sense that morals are objective to a group or individual, but those objective moral standards are themselves subjective. By extension, subjectivists also believe that reality itself is subjective. Needless to say, this is an incredibly silly ideology that very few serious philosophers take seriously, which is why it's often used as a pejorative accusation. However, moral nihilism is necessarily objectivist, metaphysically speaking, not Randian, of course. It believes in objective reality. It's just that in reality, morality is neither objective nor subjective. It simply doesn't exist. In my last video, I went over determinism and free will, in which I argued that the universe is determined and humans don't have free will. I'll try not to be too redundant here, so I suggest you watch that video if you haven't already. The most common argument determinists make against morality is about responsibility. How can you be responsible for actions that you can never have changed? I largely agree with this argument in the sense that your sentience doesn't do anything, as all it is experience. What a person believes and does is determined by their nature and nurture. So what you may see as evil thoughts or actions are really just mathematical inevitabilities based on the given factors in nature's equations. With this, we can understand that there are causes behind every thought and action. Thus, one can seek to create alternative causes to affect a person's thoughts and actions in a desired way. This perspective ultimately makes moral nihilists more capable of defusing bombs before they go off, rather than just throwing it into the water and hoping it doesn't explode. With that said, we're also better at creating bombs from perfectly normal products that you see in everyday life. So it is a two-way street. Now you may ask, how can we punish someone for an action that they are not responsible for? Well, first of all, you don't need justification for anything under moral nihilism because justice itself is a moralistic term. You do, however, give reasons, which in this case is pretty clear. It's to prevent a person from causing future harm and to disincentivize others from doing the same. Of course, the principal types likely won't be satisfied by this, so here's a more in-depth reasoning. From a functionalist perspective, a society could say that legalistically, the shell a person inhabits is responsible, perhaps not for actions, as you need agency to act, but for what it causes nonetheless. In this context, a person can be punished when they cause a harmful thing to happen, as that would make it less likely that similar things happen in the future. If large unsteady stones on the side of a mountain fall and kill someone, you clear out the hazard and take precautions for the future, even though hazards have no agency. Morality doesn't apply to a rock slide or a human causing harm, yet society responds to the two situations in a similar way, even in the current paradigm. We remove or punish the harmful agent and take precautions to prevent similar effects from occurring in the future. The main difference is that under a moral nihilist perspective, emotions and dogmatic assumptions can be taken out of the situation, and we can think more rationally about things. This is because you actually have to give logical reasons for an ought to, rather than just saying that it's good or bad, or the even lazier, because obviously. One can easily recognize that there is no such thing as good or evil, while still taking a firm position that they fervently advocate for, based on logic rather than feelings. So can there be such a thing as an objective ought to, where there are universal rules people live by? Well, if we take life or sentience out of the equation and just look at inanimate existence, how does morality work? Is it moral or immoral for a supervolcano to erupt? Is it moral or immoral for the sun to explode? Is it moral or immoral for a black hole to consume a star and the planets surrounding it? You see how absurd this sounds? These are just things that happen. If we put life into these scenarios where living things die as a result of these events, morality still doesn't apply. This is because the things that cause these events to happen do not have agency, and thus do not act. And the term ought to implies action. This shows us that morality is at least predicated on the presence of life, as it is the only thing that can act. But let's look at this in the context of life then. Is it moral or immoral for a lion to kill a zebra? Lions are carnivorous, which means they have to kill to stay alive. Either the zebra dies and gets eaten, or the lion starves to death. The results are essentially the same. There cannot be a universal moral standard in this scenario, because who's to say that the zebra's life is worth more than the lion's, or the lion's more than the zebra's? This is why I replaced the idea of morality with the idea of interest. It's the lion's interest to kill the zebra, and the zebra's interest to not be killed. The first rebuttal to the argument about interest is almost always going to be about whether there is a universal interest, which would essentially be a proxy for morality. Many claim that there is a universal interest to preserve life itself, because if life disappears from the universe, then there would be no actors to have interest. The problem with this is that the universe itself doesn't value life or sentience. Nature has no mercy for life that gets caught up in deadly natural events. We value sentience because it is in our interest to live, but inanimate existence doesn't share that interest, and thus universal interest does not exist. If the preservance of life cannot be a universal interest, then it is hard to see what could be, perhaps preserving existence itself. But that would imply that existence could be extinguished, and due to the law of conservation of mass, matter can only be broken down into smaller particles or change form, but it cannot be destroyed. Thus, this is less of an interest and more of a law of nature that cannot be changed in any way. Now, perhaps instead of a universal interest in the metaphysical sense, people propose a universal interest among the sentient. This already accepts the principle of moral nihilism, as it recognizes that morality is not a universal principle of the universe, independent of life, but is rather a construct of the human mind. However, these people attempt to simulate a universal principle that they themselves admit doesn't exist in the context of human society, while claiming that it's objective. The problem with this is that the sentience of others is not necessarily part of our own interest. Similar to the lion killing zebra example from earlier, some people's interests are so diametrically opposed that it is in the interest of one to kill the other. This simple fact of life shatters the vulnerable illusion of which many of us cling to or promote, even with full knowledge of its phantasmal nature. But if we were to act in daily life with this knowledge, wouldn't society just fall into chaos? Well, given the proper incentives, people will determine their interests to be intertwined with the interest of society. People form a society for a reason, to escape the state of nature. They agree to give an entity a disproportionately large amount of power, and in exchange it uses that power to punish those who do things that are harmful to society. It also incentivizes people to do what is in the best interest for society, through various policies, regulations, and rights. People support this because they find it to be in their interest to give up the freedom to murder in exchange for protection from murder, along with many other things. The potential downsides of one, the potential of being murdered, does not balance out the meager gain of the other, being able to murder one's enemies. Plus, there are simply better options to deal with them, like maybe you can talk to them so you can understand each other a little better. And maybe then you don't see each other as enemies anymore, but rather opponents, rivals, friendly competitors. Yeah, I have a feeling that's not going to happen with a lot of people. But regardless, most people understand that there is very little gain in killing or harming someone. Even if someone finds it in their interest to be against the interest of society, they still have to take into account the implications and consequences of their actions. Some might find it in their interest to blow up a building because of reasons, but they may also find it to be in their interest to not go to jail for the rest of their lives. Given that, if someone is sane, intelligent, and has something to lose, then they will likely come to the conclusion that going through with it is probably not a good idea. If, however, they are not sane or intelligent, or they have nothing to lose, then they will likely go through with it regardless of morality being a thing or not. Lastly, even if people do value morality so much that it alone guides them in certain instances, everyone does what they do because they believe what they do is right, or at the very least justified. Someone may argue that it is morally right or justified to kill someone for a greater good of some sort. Now, you could argue with them over ideas like universal principles that they likely won't agree on, or you could talk to them about what their interests are and if there are any better ways of achieving them. Even if both actors in the scenario believe in morality, there is clearly a better way of finding a resolution to this disagreement, and that is discussing interest rather than morals. A lot of people tend to fall into the naturalistic fallacy and say something like, if my life is determined, then why shouldn't I just let life happen to me? Or, if there is no such thing as morality, then why shouldn't I just kill my neighbor that I don't like? These are reductio ad absurdum arguments that ignore practical reality and just assume that you have to live by your philosophy. This comes from a principled view that everything has to optically look consistent to be consistent, when the fact is that reality is more complicated than that. Even though your life is determined, you should live as if you have free will so that life doesn't pass you by. Doing the opposite would just be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And even though it isn't immoral to kill your neighbor, you shouldn't due to the inevitable consequences. So, in short, recognize reality, live in the fantasy world that is human society, and make decisions that balance the two in a healthy manner. Thank you all for watching and have a nice day.